pay for any of my artwork. Okay, so why fuss with water? It's colorless, it's odorless. It's supposed to be colorless and odorless, and it's cheap. It's one of the only, well, I'm pretty sure it is the only brewing ingredient that is regularly just sourced locally. You don't special order water. It's really heavy, so it's really heavy, really expensive to ship in. So people aren't ordering their water from Bavaria to make their Pilsners. It's often underestimated. It's probably your least sexy ingredient, right? So it doesn't have that big, bountiful, dank aroma that hops do. You can't stick your nose into it. I mean, you can, but that can hurt. It doesn't grow. It's not alive like yeast. At least it's not supposed to grow. So it's really kind of boring, right? So why bother with it? A lot of people don't. A lot of people make good beers. A lot of people have won medals here with just straight Cleveland water, which is decent for brewing. I'm going to try and talk you out of just using straight Cleveland water and try to tell you simple ways to improve your water. You can make good beer with just straight unadulterated Cleveland water. If you really want to step it up if you want to step it up a little, you can really improve for most styles just by tinkering with your water a little bit. Sometimes a lot, depending on the style that you're brewing. And there's very little guidance that I've found at least in the 2015 BJCP guidelines. They rarely talk about water, which is kind of surprising to me because it can play such a huge role in your overall character of your beer. I mean, the clarity, the taste, just the aftertaste, how your beer ferments. It all comes down to water, and the guidelines don't really even hint to it. Every once in a while they'll say something like it might have a minerally taste. Well, what does that mean? What exactly is the mineral you're tasting? So let's get into it. Cleveland water. It's abundant. We live next to the 11th largest lake in the world, surface area-wise at least. If most of us here are pulling off of that lake, I know some of us have well water if you live a little bit further inland, but for the most part, it's all single-sourced. It's regionally consistent. I did a couple dozen tests. Towards the end, I'll show you a link to where the results of all those tests are. And I've also compiled quite a few lab tests that have been done from local area, and it's all really, really consistent. There's a few things that vary a little bit, but for the most part, it's really consistent, which is nice. We live in a great area in that regard. Some areas aren't so lucky. They're pulling water from multiple reservoirs, from rivers that fluctuate in their mineral content seasonally. So we're lucky in that we have such a large lake with good quality water that we can pull from. It makes it a lot easier for me to give this presentation and to give actual recipes based on what our assumed mineral levels are. It's pretty easy to treat. Our water it's not overly hard. It's not too soft. For most beers, you can simply just add salts to your water profile to get where you want. Some styles I'll go over, you might want to lower a few things and maybe blend it with a little bit of RO or distilled. But for the most part, Cleveland water is pretty good to work with. And it hardly ever catches on fire. It's been like 1969 the last time. So that should be your step one, by the way. If your water is still on fire, put it out first. Make a rock beer or something. Okay. So these are the steps for a typical municipal water treatment. So it's coming out of the lake. You can see that in the far upper left of that diagram. The coagulation, where all the minerals and all the biologics kind of clump together. The sedimentation, where they let those particulates drop out. They go through a sand and charcoal filtration. It's fairly simple. It's not necessarily pulling everything out. It's basically trying to the sand and the charcoal is trying to get most of the larger particulates and some of the organics out with the charcoal. Then for disinfection, we're really lucky. Cleveland uses free chlorine. A lot of the you don't know, if you don't know the difference between chlorine and chloramine, I'm going to tell you, but just consider yourself blessed, because chloramine is a bitch to remove from your water compared to chlorine. You can use a lot of the same methods to remove it, but it takes a lot longer. It's a lot more difficult. So we're very lucky that Cleveland area is using chlorine.
Just real quick, is chloramine used more for like well water or something like that?
So chloramine stays in the water longer. It doesn't react to the air. It doesn't evaporate out as quickly. So a lot of places that use it have longer distribution networks where they need to have the chloramine stay in the water longer when they're pushing it out. It'll actually react to some of the metals, or the chlorine will react to some of the metals sometimes, especially if they're older lead pipes. Not a good thing.
Is it a regional area that uses that, though?
It's becoming more and more popular everywhere, actually. Yeah.
Normal uses it as they pull out of a reservoir, so they think but you can neutralize it.
You can. I'm not going to go too deep into chloramine since this is a Cleveland water presentation and we don't have to deal with them. But there are ways to. Right.
Sulfide neutralizes it.
That's the next slide.
Okay. Okay.
So. Okay.
All right, I'm done.
Get the duct tape out.
So after you get it from your tap, basically, after the municipal treating that's done, there are a couple different options you can do here. Open air off-gassing to get rid of your chlorine is probably the first thing you should attempt if you're first home brewing. It's pretty easy. You're basically just filling up your brew kettle the night before with water, letting it sit out and letting that chlorine evaporate out over time. If you want to speed up that process, you can heat the water up a little bit. You can aerate it. Just stirring it's going to help that chlorine off-gas faster. The next step that I've actually been using more and more lately is using Camden tablets. I have some here. They're about 500 to 600 milligrams. These little tiny tablets will treat about 20 gallons of water. And that's assuming the worst case scenario as far as what the EPA allows for chlorine to be added. So one little tiny tablet will treat 20 gallons of water. Now, I'm usually not whipping up a batch of water that's 20 gallons. And I don't recommend trying to cut one of those little tablets in half. I make up like maybe a gallon batch of water, especially when I'm making coffee water and I'm using some of this. And you don't want to like cut off a little tenth of that pill. You have no way of knowing. So what I found that works well is I'll dissolve an entire tablet in a little quart jar. I'll measure how much water is in there to begin with. I'll dissolve the entire tablet out, and then it's a ratio, right? So I'll pour, if I'm doing 1 gallon, I'll pour 1/20th of that dissolved water into the water that I'm treating. These tablets are super cheap. This comes in a bag of 100. It's probably a lifetime supply for me.
If you use one tablet for an entire 5-gallon batch, it's going to treat 20. Are you going to get any off flavor or issues for you?
Well, you can, not necessarily. You can get some sulfite. So it's, well, what the Camden tablets that LD Carlson sells are potassium metabisulfite, which are nice. What that's basically going to do is it's going to turn into, and Paul, you can correct me on this one, sulfur? Yeah, sulfur dioxide and chloride, I believe, right?
But the worst case is that it might stunt your yeast a little bit if you overdo it.
Right. So it'll add a little too much chloride to it? I don't know what happens when you overdo it, to be honest.
Too much sulfide is not good.
Okay, too much sulfide.
You can buy it powder form too.
Yeah,
And just measure out.
powder would be a good way to, yeah,
You know, a pinch is the official measurement.
the official measurement. One thing I noticed with it is it does kind of give you it can give you a bad smell. So when you first put it in, when it's reacting and starts to off-gas, it can actually smell a little bit like a locker room. But it off-gases kind of quick. You don't really have to worry too much about it, especially after you heat it up. If it's your strike water or something, it goes away pretty quick. Yes, Tim?
Yeah. Potassium is probably dominant far as I'm concerned, that's only good for minor cleaning. There's no reason to use salt, metal by salt. And that's what they used to use in wine and so on, for sanitary, to go to.
Yeah, so,
Make sure it's potassium is.
right, so when you buy it, make sure it's potassium metabisulfite. Yeah, it's what LD is selling for the most part now. It's what I've seen in my local homebrew shops. Okay, so the next option that you should look into, carbon block filtering. A lot of breweries around here use that. If it's just a straight carbon block, that's good for removing chlorine, chloramine, zinc, and organics. So it'll remove your chloramine. I'm not going to get, I guess I've already talked too much about chloramine, but it basically takes a lot longer, and sometimes you have to run it through your charcoal filter a couple times to get all your chloramine out. The thing with chloride is, so it can exist in parts per billion. It can exist below the flavor threshold in your water for chlorine or chloramine. But when you add it to your mash, it's going to start reacting with the phenols that come out of your grain. And those chlorophenols are actually, the threshold so that you can taste those chlorophenols are in the parts per billion. So you don't need very many, hardly any chlorine could really come out as chlorophenols in your end product in your beer. So you don't want to leave any in there if possible. You really want to try and remove it as much as you can. Another method of treating your water would be heating and boiling it. That's going to get rid of your chlorine. That's going to precipitate out some of your bicarbonate, or your temporary hardness. So if you want to soften your water up a little bit. It's not a very common method used. I've done it a few times and actually made some really good beers out of it, but it's energy. It takes a lot of extra energy, a lot of extra time. You lose water. You know, obviously you're boiling some of that off too, so you're losing some of your volume. So it's not used very often, but historically it's been used.
How hard does that have calcium to make that reaction? So you have to add calcium to that before you boil it, so it reacts.
So if you want to soften it, you have to actually add more calcium.
Before you boil it, because it'll only work if there's only, I think, 35 or 55% of calcium. More than that, it just won't react.
Okay, interesting. Another method is distillation. So that's a little bit different from all the other treatments that I have listed here, because instead of trying to remove things from the water, you're basically removing the water from everything else. So distillation is basically evaporating it, condensing it, and taking that hopefully pure water out of it. Distillation is going to remove your mineral ions, your heavy metals, and your organics. Certain things it will not remove, like chlorine. It's not going to remove because chlorine's got a higher boiling point than water. So when you distill it, it's actually the chlorine's gonna come out first, and then it's gonna end up in your distilled water. So if you buy distilled water at the grocery store, you don't have to worry. It's usually a multi-step. It's usually not just distilled. It's also run through a carbon filter. So there's other methods of getting, you'll find a lot of the commercial breweries are using multiple treatments here. They're not just using one. So another option would be reverse osmosis. So that's basically using pressure and pushing your water through a very thin membrane. And what that's going to do is remove all of your dissolved solids. You probably want to use that in combination with a carbon block filter as well. It's going to help with the organics with the carbon block filter. Some things that might be really small and might still fit through your membrane. It depends on the type of membrane. Some of these systems can be pretty expensive. I saw a few on the floor at the Homebrewers Conference, and they were, I think, $350, and they didn't look that nice. I mean, they were little small plastic boxes that made a lot of noise. The other thing about reverse osmosis is that it takes a long time, typically, unless you have a way overkill system. I know Frank Berrickman down at Restoration Brew Works down in Delaware, Ohio, ROs all of his water. And he's got to do that a day or two ahead of time just to have enough for his batch. It takes a long time. You can find, I usually just get distilled water when I'm trying to blend stuff in because it's really cheap. I get it for less than $1 a gallon at Mark's. But there's places around here where you can buy RO water as well. It's usually pretty cheap. So Another step or another potential treatment would be an ion exchange resin. What this basically is, these are usually a series of cylinders that are chemically treated so that the ions are going to react with different metals, or different minerals, I should say, in the water. And usually the only, all that they produce is water, and all of the other different ions are basically attracted to the resins and stuck in the resins. So there isn't a whole lot of scale buildup or anything. It's immediate. It happens very quick. When you run them through these systems, they're very efficient, and you can basically get deionized water. So if you've heard of deionized water, this is essentially how they do it. They use ion exchange resins. One thing that I found interesting, which is the next option, is a multi-stage cartridge filter. That's basically your Brita pitcher. I've been using that quite a bit over the years to filter my water. It makes great tasting water. I had no idea that it was more than a carbon filter until I got this iDip test and wondered why all my numbers were so low after testing all of my water after I ran it through my Brita pitcher. So apparently these multi-stage cartridge filters, and I've got a few, I tested a few of them out. I got a generic one, I got a Brita one. The numbers are completely different, so there's no standard for what types of minerals it's removing. It is a combination of carbon and an ion exchange resin. So it's softening the water too, basically. If you have, yeah, sit down, Paul, come on. So I actually wouldn't recommend using a Brita pitcher if you're trying to adjust your water profile, because you really don't know what's coming out of that pitcher. They're good for about 40 gallons. So if you're filtering out 10 or 20 gallons for a brew session, the amount of minerals that it's filtering out when you first start until the half-life of that cartridge is going to be different. So there's no real way, unless you have a test kit and you're going to test your ultimate water after you've got it all done, there's no real way to know and to be able to adjust if you're targeting specific water profiles using a pitcher. So my recommendations would be to use Cannon tabs or just a straight carbon block filter around here, if all you're looking to do is remove chlorine.
Andrew, I got a quick question.
Yeah.
For you or one of our professional brew friends here, is it safe to assume then that if you boil your work, you're not going to remove your chlorine because it's already done some binding in the mash? That's not going to be...
Right, so your chlorophenols are formed in the mash itself. So that's why, I remember you asked, I remember Paul asked something about that when, I forget which presentation it was, but yeah, so you'd think in your boil, you'd get rid of all your chlorine in the boil. But the problem is the damage is already done in the mash. Those phenols have already bound with the chlorine in the mash before it even gets to the boil. And it doesn't have to take a lot. Like I said, it's parts per billion that these chlorophenols, these off flavors.
So boil the day before.
Yeah, I mean, that is an option. That's on my list here. You can boil all your water the day before. It's really resource intensive, time intensive. You can make some great beer that way.
So you have to, like, room temperature would be kind of that works
For chlorine, that works. That's the first one. Chloramine, interestingly, will also evaporate out, but it takes about the same amount of time to evaporate chloramine as it does water itself. And it's like it's something ridiculous. Like if you put a 5-gallon pot out there, it'll take 45 days to get rid of the chloramine, and by then there's nothing in your pot. So yeah, we're really lucky we don't have to deal with that. Yes, sir?
You said you made with your Cannon tab with like water. Like how long do you let that water sit around, or what do you do with that water when it's not being used to treat things?
Oh, I dump it out. Those tabs are cheap. So I don't store it. I don't know.
You mean after you put the Cannon tablets on?
Yeah, so if I'm only using a little tiny bit of it to treat like a gallon of water, I just don't care because it's so cheap. I just dump the rest down the drain. But I don't know if there's a shelf life on it or not.
Does it matter if you run the water through a carbon filter before or after you use a Cannon tab?
That'd be redundant unless you have a really old carbon filter, because your carbon filter is going to take out your chlorine anyway. Most of it, almost all of it. It's usually sufficient unless your carbon filter is really old and needs to be replaced.
Yeah, Andrew, it depends on flow rate and age. So carbon filter it, and then put in a little of the Canton afterward just to be on the safe side. It has other benefits too, because it's a really good antioxidant, and it can, if you believe in hot side aeration, it can help alleviate that. Ask Tim about.
Pre-boil all your water.
Well, ask Tim about the color of his filters.
Okay. Actually, I should have pointed this out earlier. This is an actual carbon filter. This is Mike Antalchuk's. Thank you for bringing this in. This is basically for houses. What is it good for? Like 700 gallons or?
I think it's more like 2,000.
3,000? Yeah. I mean, it'll last you a long time. And these cartridges are replaceable. This is well under $100 for one of these.
How do you know that doesn't have a resin?
I asked Mike that question.
Because you don't know that the Brennum or the Pure or any of those.
You know, if I was
anything but carbon.
if I was smarter, I would have gone to the Brita website a long time ago. They actually do say that they're using an ion exchange resin as well as carbon inside there. There is some documentation. I don't know about this one in
I
particular.
looked at the label when I went to the store,
Yeah.
and it said this was just a pure carbon filter.
And also, it is a great source for good carbon filter. I mean, just
You
filters
ready
out.
directions, Mike?
Now you can actually get replacement filters that are probably going to be more expensive, that are more than just carbon.
This was pricier than the normal filter, but it was the filter that fit that head.
Yes.
One word of advice when you're using active carbon filtration, just get the little cheapo test strips that test for chlorine, you just stick it in there, it changes color. They're really cheap, and that tells you when the thing is working or it's not.
Yep. Yeah, you don't want to just go by your own nose and taste. Very little chlorine can cause some major problems.
When you do a carbon filter, it's flowing water. I mean,
Oh yeah.
well, I mean, if it slows down, I mean, it's clogged or it's not.
They don't always slow down though, they're not like a regular.
It's not like, okay.
Yeah,
check-
I just pull very slowly through it.
Yeah, that's what I meant by flow rate. You
Yeah.
run it slowly. You don't crank it up to full water pressure. 'Cause
Right.
Basically.
So this hooks up to a garden hose. You don't want to just flow this your normal garden hose rate. It's about a gallon
I
per
put a spigot
minute.
on it, and that's what I try to do is do about a gallon a minute.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your filter specifically. This one here is about a gallon a minute that you want to aim for.
What's that too?
The micron filter size, or does it matter?
I'm not sure. Because you're not really trying to get the particulate. I mean, your Cleveland water shouldn't have the large particulates in it anyway.
When you're talking about testing the strips, does that mean that when filters I use say they're good for 6 months or 10,000
Don't go by
whatever it is?
no. Don't go by the dates. Because
Yeah,
they put those dates on. They don't know the water that you're putting into it to begin with. They don't know how heavily
Oh,
treated.
For brewing, it doesn't get used for anything else.
That's why you want to use the strips. Yeah.
It may be good for longer.
Yeah. Maybe I would probably more err on the side of caution.
Well, I do.
But-
They're cheap.
Yeah. Okay. So pH, what is it and why does it matter? pH it actually stands for, and there's a little bit of debate, but I think it stands for the power of hydrogen. Not the same sort of hydrogen that Dr. Manhattan here has the power over. That's a hydrogen atom tattoo on his forehead. That's why I put him up there. So basically, it's a ratio. It's a ratio. I've heard people say it's a count of the hydronium ions, the positive hydrogen ions that are in your water, but it's really more of a ratio of hydronium to hydroxide. So those are two types of ions that hydrogen can break down into, or not break down into, but basically an ion. I think that's on my next slide. But an ion's it's basically a atom, or it can be polyatomic, but it is gained or lost an electron, or two, or three, or more. So basically, high pH has more hydronium than hydroxide, which is a little contradictory because high pH has more hydronium. Someone correct me if I'm wrong in this, but it's got more hydronium, and it actually goes up or it goes down in number. Yeah. So I might have that a little reversed.
Alkaline, don't worry about it.
Right. So this is, yeah, I told you guys I wasn't a chemist. I'm probably digging a little bit deeper than I have any right to right now. But so basically, high pH is base. Some of your cleaners, your lime, those sorts of things are high pH. Your low pH are acidic. Why is pH important? You need the right pH levels for proper mash conversion, extraction of flavors, for proper yeast health, and it also contributes to beer storage stability and taste. Finished beer is somewhere around, I want to say 4.2 pH or so it's right below the threshold that chloroforms need. So those are the really dangerous bacteria that can kill you. That's why they don't live in beer. So it's not just the alcohol that's in your beer that makes it stable and last longer, it's also the lower pH that makes that beverage more stable and be able to last longer without things growing in it, basically. All the time. Measure it all the time, yeah. So, there's different ways to measure your pH. If you don't want to buy any equipment, you can just go by a local water analysis report and assume that the pH has not changed since when that report was taken. They all have the pH on them, even the most simple ones. The next step up, which I do not necessarily recommend, are these little pH strips that change color, and they're very, very difficult to differentiate between one color to the next, at least for me. I have a couple here, one that's made just for mash brewing, which is between 4.6 and 6.2, pretty big range. And I've got one that's a little more vague that goes up to 8 or so. But they're kind of hard to read. They're not very precise. And you know, you're plus or minus half a pH usually, and sometimes that can make a difference. So another style of pH meters here, this is what I'd call a pen style. Yeah, it's wet, it's been used. So this is basically, has some electrodes here, and it's measuring your pH. This one has automatic temperature control, which is nice. A lot of the pen style do not have automatic temperature control. A lot of the pen style do not have a very high precision either, so if you're gonna buy one of these to test your pH, I'd recommend getting one that can at least measure to 1/10 of a pH. This one does, but not all of them do. These are pretty cheap, usually under $100. You want to go up another level. This is my pH meter. This is a dual probe, so it's Milwaukee M102. This is just for the temperature. And this, which is sitting in a little storage solution vat right there, this is your electrode. So the pen style has both of these built in. This just has them separately. Now it's important to measure the temperature, or for the device to measure the temperature. It's assumed when you're reading pH that you're at 25 degrees Celsius, which is about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So the higher temperatures will actually lower your pH, if I have that right. Yeah. So higher temperatures will make your water appear to be more acidic. If you don't have automatic temperature control, they're not going to, you can have a normal room temperature 7 pH water, and all you have to do is heat it up, and it's going to change your pH value. So when you're doing a pH reading, the important thing to take away from this to remember is to try and get it down to room temperature, get it as close to 25 Celsius as possible before doing your reading. The automatic temperature control is, I don't trust it. It doesn't necessarily work 100% of the time as advertised. So even with these, most people I know that are using automatic temperature control pH meters are still trying to get that water down to room temperature before taking the reading. And another option, which I'm not exactly sure how it works, but you can use one of these photometers too. This has a pH reading. I'm not all that happy with the results that it's given because it always reads 7.0. I have never gotten a reading other than 7.0. And to be fair, the water that I've tested is around 7.0, But with the other types of pH meters, I go anywhere from like 7.0 to 7.6. But the photometer always thinks it's 7. So
Did you open it up to see if there's actually anything in it?
yeah, it feels very light. No, it reads the other minerals very. It detects them. It detects the minerals well, but pH, that's one thing I think.
Take that sticker off that says 7.0.
Yeah. Okay, and why bother? So why bother measuring your pH? Well, if you're doing all grain, you should bother. You should care about your mash pH. If you're doing lighter beers especially, and you're having to acidify your mash in order to get it down within an appropriate range, you're really going to want to you don't want to just throw in lactic acid and hope for the best. Even if some of my recipes, I have things like lactic acid, but I have stars all over it saying don't do this unless you have a pH meter. You really should be testing it just to make sure. If you make your beer too acidic, if you make your water too acidic before you brew with it, it can actually come through in the flavor. You might still have your conversions might still be okay, but then your beer could taste really tart, especially on these lighter beers that are more common to add acid to.
Yeah.
Yes?
The big question, I always get different answers, is when is the right time to take that pH reading of the mash?
Throughout?
And
You gotta make sure your salts are in there, your adjustments.
Yeah.
You gotta thoroughly mix mash. After you if you put these salt adjustments in there, gypsum, calcium chloride, whatever, make sure those hydrate. You should always hydrate those outside before you put it in the mash. Never put salts directly in the mash.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Even chalk?
especially chalk.
Chalk doesn't dissolve
It doesn't
well at all.
Right, and that's why I was under the impression you're supposed to put chalk directly into the mash because it doesn't dissolve in the water.
So you're saying you put them into the mash water before you add any grains?
Either that or just do it in a little cup of water. Yeah, take some of the water. So the idea is that you want to make those things all make pH adjustments. You want to put those in. You want to get your temperature. Make sure you should focus on hitting your saccharification temperature first. Mix up real well with all your salts in there, and then take a good pH reading. Make sure you lower it down, like he said. Bring it down to as much as you can. Ice that little ice bath or something, bring it down to the right temperature, and then take a pH reading.
And you want to get liquid, right?
Yeah, you want to have as much husk and grain as you can, obviously. You don't add pH.
Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about alkalinity and buffers. The main buffer that you're going to have in your water around here is bicarbonate. It's keeping your water and your mash from getting too low. So if you're using a lot of dark malts, if you're making a stout, those dark malts actually add acidity to the mash itself. So, and it'll bring it way down below out of range. It'll bring it, if you don't have any bicarbonates in your water, or very low bicarbonates, your mash is going to be below 5.3. You're not going to have good conversions. It's going to actually taste sour as well at the end. So bicarbonates can be a good thing. We've got quite a bit in our water. I think we have 90. I have another slide on it, but I think we have somewhere around 90 parts per million of bicarbonates, usually measured as H3O or HC03. Yeah, chemistry. So other than your bicarbonate, other things that can adjust your pH are gypsum and calcium, calcium chloride, I should say. Those aren't actual ions, but those are some of the salts you can buy at your local homebrew store. They're super cheap. They're like $1 for this, and this will do quite a few batches. Those are going to lower your pH. Chalk and baking soda will rise your pH. We typically don't have to worry about lifting our pH, so it's not typically recommended to use chalk or baking soda. Another method is using chemical acidulation, so using lactic and phosphoric are two of the most common. I use lactic just because that's what they're selling at my local homebrew shop. Once again, real cheap. Just use a little hypodermic.
Between like less than 2 to 1%, very little.
Right. The less acid you have to add, the better. So if you find yourself using a lot of acid, you're better off kind of diluting your water instead of using just straight tap water, maybe diluted with like 50-50 RO. So you've got less bicarbonate that you're trying to neutralize with the acid.
You want to bring down the pH, but you don't want to add any lactic flavor.
Right. So a lot of the professional breweries use phosphoric acid. I think you may be able to buy it in homebrew shops now too, but it's, yeah. So that's another method. I think it has a little less taste influence in the final product, which is why it's more popular commercially.
It's the same thing that the salts form with the malt.
Okay.
Phosphoric acid.
So, and that's the next one is acidulated malt. That's basically malt that's been allowed to but it basically has some bacteria on the outside that's growing creating some phosphoric acid, or lactic. That's what I thought it was.
No, the other is just a chemical reaction. Phosphorus in the malt. There's no fermentation or
Yes, Todd?
So you can get, I use phosphoric acid as well. I use phosphoric water is very soft, very clean, but it does have a lot of carbon in it. And I find that just a few milliliters of phosphoric in a nice 10-gallon batch. You're not running the risk of bringing the sourness and the lactic. Cheap.
1 to 2 milliliters in a 10-gallon batch. I put that in a 5-gallon batch or even more, and I haven't had any issues. I wouldn't go much over. I think one of the recipes I have, I'm putting up to 0.4 milliliters, but I wouldn't. And this is per gallon. But I wouldn't do that if without a pH meter, and I would slowly ramp it up.
But the lactic is usually 85% phosphoric, usually percent phosphoric.
Okay.
So you don't have to worry as much.
If you're using acidulated malt, you probably don't want to go over 5% malt bill in any given recipe, unless you want kind of sour presence, then maybe go 10%. 15% definitely make 15%, definitely make some twang, but 25%. You not only alter your mash chemistry, not only favorably, but you also drinkability. You kind of enjoy the drinkability. And it's Reinheit's to go here, and it's Reinheit's to go 500 here. 500 here.
Okay, so. Thanks, Tim. I'm not going to say that. So I'm going to go into some specific mineral ions here. What are ions? They're basically charged atoms or ionic compounds. So it might not just be one atom. It might be an actual molecule that's charged. Cations are positive, anions are negative, and they have a natural tendency to seek balance. That's why you have different chemicals reacting with one another. One's charged, one's not. They're attracted in that way. Not a chemist. Water is a very efficient medium for ionizing mineral compounds. Which for most compounds, they dissolve very quickly, especially chloride-based compounds. They dissolve very quickly in water. Certain things like chalk, obviously, Epsom salt doesn't dissolve very easily, but it will. And different levels of different ions, and I'm going to go more into detail about specific ones are required for proper yeast health. They're going to dictate your pH. Your hardness is all dictated by the different ions that are in there. And it's going to affect your beer aroma, the flavor, the mouthfeel, and the clarity of your product. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is sulfate. Your recommended concentration is 0 to 350 parts per million. You can go higher. If you go over, I think, is it 250 or 300 or so, you can start tasting some of the sulfur, which is usually a negative. Some people prefer it. I don't know. I haven't met any of those people, but I've read that some people prefer the higher sulfate content. It should be less than 150 unless your beer is very highly hot. Yeah, over 350 I have it. Yeah, it's going to produce a sulfury aroma, and it'll actually create an astringency. So your hop bitterness is going to come through as kind of a long-lasting, astringent taste as opposed to a nice, clean, sharp bitterness. Now, in the appropriate amounts, it's going to accentuate your hop bitterness. It's going to make your beer taste drier and crisper. Obviously, the beer I'm talking about here is an IPA. This is where sulfate is the most popular. to add sulfates to your beer, you got a couple choices: calcium sulfate and magnesium sulfate. So it's gypsum and Epsom salt. You're probably only ever going to have to add gypsum. Most people don't add Epsom salt. Most people turn into a diuretic over 125 parts per million, and that's not fun. The calcium sulfate's going to add some calcium to your water too, which is usually something that you're trying to increase your levels on anyway, so you can knock off two birds with one stone by adding the gypsum. Okay, and moving on to calcium. The recommended doses are 50 to 100. It's going to affect your pH. You need a certain level. I think it's at least 30. I usually aim for over 50 to get proper beer clarity. So if you're really low on calcium, your beers probably aren't going to clear very well. And you can add calcium. Calcium it combines with a lot of different ions, so it works. You have a lot of different sources to add calcium. You have the gypsum I already talked about, the calcium chloride, which is another very important salt. I have an example of that. If anybody hasn't ever added salts or bought salts, I brought most of mine up here so you can come and check them out. But I have some calcium chloride up there too. Sodium bicarbonate, which is just baking soda. Calcium carbonate, which is chalk. The next one, magnesium. Now the recommended dose of magnesium, you can basically start with brewing water with 0 magnesium, and for the most part, you're going to get enough coming out of your grains required for proper yeast health. Magnesium works similarly to calcium in that it helps pull flavor compounds out of your grain. However, higher levels are going to cause your beer to be much more astringent. So it's typically preferred that you're using calcium instead of, or that you're keeping your magnesium relatively low. You usually don't need to increase your magnesium because, like I said, you can get the amount of magnesium that you need out of your grains, even if your water doesn't have any. We have about 9 parts per million in ours, so we have a little bit, but it's also necessary. It's also helpful for yeast health and flocculation. Chloride. Another important one. I talked about sulfate earlier. I'm going to talk further on about a sulfite chloride ratio. That's important to be if you're going for a malty beer versus a hoppy beer. This is the other side of that ratio. It's recommended in doses of 10 to 250 parts per million. Typically, you want to keep it under 100 parts per million when sulfate is also high. Otherwise, your beer is going to come through really harsh. So you can't just if you want to make a balanced double IPA that's got a lot of malt character, you can't just throw in a ton of chloride and a ton of sulfate. It's going to come off really rough. So you got to keep the ratio in mind, not just the total number of parts per million for your chloride. It's going to accentuate your maltiness. It's going to add body to your beer. And most chloride compounds dissolve very easily in water. You don't have to throw them in the night before or heat the water up. They just almost immediately dissolve. You shake them up a little bit and they're gone, especially calcium chloride. And sodium chloride's another way you can add it. Sodium isn't typically desired in beer, so most people don't add kosher table salt. I think my next slide is sodium, actually. No. Well, I'll talk about sodium later. But so the next ion that I have in here is bicarbonate. The recommended concentrations here are 0 to 50 parts per million for light beers, 50 to 150 for medium beers, and 150 to 250 for dark roasted beers. The higher concentrations are necessary for those roasted beers in order to keep your pH in check, to keep your pH from getting too low. It's going to buffer it. It's going to actually raise your pH. Cleveland water levels are pretty high for most light beers, but for most other types of beers, for dark beers and for amber beers, we have a great bicarbonate level in our water. And I will go over what our water levels are. You can add this by adding chalk, which is not recommended, or baking soda. Basically, with Cleveland water, you don't really need to add bicarbonate for most of our styles, so I would not recommend it. You have to know what's in there, you have to know what the levels are in there, but you don't necessarily have to add it back in. So sodium, the recommended concentration is 0 to 150 parts per million, which is a huge range. We have very low sodium in our water. I've heard that seasonally water can fluctuate. It happens more in river-based aquifers where you have a lot of runoff that's going into the river, where if you have a lot of road salt during the winter, and in the spring you start pulling water off, it might be a little saltier. We've got such a big lake, it's really not going to affect it that much. I found very little variance in the tests that I've done. And since we have a pretty low sodium rate, we're never anywhere near 150 parts per million, so we have nothing to worry about with sodium. It's typically not desired for most, so higher levels are typically not desired. It can round out your malt sweetness, it can accentuate it. I haven't experimented with that before. I just read that it could, but most recipes I've seen are asking for lower sodium rates. If you want to round it out, you're better off with chloride, really, than increasing your sodium. So how do you measure ions? You can have a professional lab report done, lab analysis done. I know quite a few of you have had those done at your house. Some of you have shared those with me. Thank you. You can also use little test strips for certain ions, which test strips are a little difficult to read. If you're looking for a precise number, it's kind of difficult to read. And you can also use this photometer that Mike.
You can also use a municipal water report.
Yeah, that's what I meant by the water analysis report. So Mike and I bought one of these brand new whiz-bang iDip photometers, which is basically using these little strips here. You fill up a little container here with water, and that strip has a little bit of a chemical on the end of the strip. So you set it for 20 seconds, and you put that strip in your water solution here, and you wave it around for about 20 seconds, and what it does is it dissolves that mineral that's on the end of that test strip. And then it shoots a light through there, and it measures how that light refracts, and so it measures with light the specific number of ions that are in your water report. I found pretty decent results for the most part with that iDip photometer. It's very similar to a lot of the professional commercial lab analysis or the municipal water supply lab water reports. Lake County, I noticed, doesn't really offer a very good one. So we have to have ours out in Lake County tested or use one of these, but Cleveland offers one. I've included some of that information in this presentation. So one thing to keep in mind, when you're reading a water report, or even when you're using one of these photometers yourself, you have to convert, in order to use its values in your brewing calculators, which is the next slide, I think. You have to make sure that you're reading the right thing. So with this iDip photometer, I was wondering, my calcium kept reading it like 70 parts per million, which is way too high for around here. But it was consistent. It was very consistent, and it was much higher than it should be reading. And actually, Rick pointed that out to me and said, no, your calcium's way off. And I told him, well, I don't know, it's what it says. Eventually, I read through the manual, and it said it was measuring it as calcium carbonate. And in order to calculate, in order to get the actual calcium from there, since it was a polyatomic ion, you had to multiply it by 0.4. I'm not going to get into moles or anything, but that's basically, there's some math behind there. So there's some math behind there. Basically, it's not measuring the calcium directly, the individual calcium. It's measuring the calcium carbonate. So it's measuring the compounds that are in there, not just the pieces of the compounds that you're really interested in. And sulfate's the same way. I saw a water report that was done, Mike McCarskey had one done that had sulfate that was measured as SO4 minus S. And that looked a little off too. So I looked it up, and in order to plug it into most brewing calculators, they're just looking for SO4. So you have to multiply it by 3. Chloride is typically measured. 3. And chloride's typically measured as salt, as calcium chloride, and that's the same way sodium's typically measured, or sodium chloride. So just something to keep in mind. If you're using a brewing water spreadsheet like I use, just make sure the numbers that you're plugging in, if it says that your water report is calculating it as a specific molecule, make sure that matches up with what you're entering it in, because it could be measuring it differently. You might have to apply a conversion factor before you can enter it into your brewing water spreadsheet. So here are the ranges of the Cleveland levels that I observed. I'm not going to put all of them up here because I've got a couple dozen of them. I have a link at the end of this to my Google Docs page where I've shared them all. Anyone can look at them. But these are basically the ranges. So in Cleveland, we have a pH that ranges between 7 and 7.6, and that's not regionally specific, so it's not like Willoughby always has 7.3 and Lakewood always has 7.6. It actually does fluctuate a little bit. That has to do with how they're treating it. But that's still kind of a tight range, so it's not too bad. Your total alkalinity is going to be around 70 to 100 parts per million. These are all numbers that you're going to need to know in order to put into your brewing water spreadsheet. Your total hardness is going to be 100 to 130 parts per million. Your bicarbonates, I noticed that ranged quite a bit. So in the results, I saw that in the actual reports that came back, it was 85 to 120 parts per million. Most of them in Cleveland and on the east side where I live, they were closer to 90. But I did see 2 professional, they were both from Ward Labs in North Olmsted and in where Steve lives, Aurora. They were both up near 120. So it does range a little bit in the area. Don't know exactly why. It's probably those areas, how they're treating their water. The calcium levels are all very consistent, 30 to 35 parts per million. Sulfate's going to be 25 to 40. Your chloride's 15 to 30. Your magnesium's almost always 9. And your sodium's 10 to 20. That's a really low score for sodium. A lot of the historic brewing cities have much higher sodium levels. And that's not typically a salt that you want in your beer. So it's good that we have a low level. So for the recipes that I'm about to give, these are the levels that I assumed. I used, because I had to plug them all in, I had to use basically one water profile. I wanted to even out the cations and the anions. And so this is basically an average of the couple dozen different readings that I took. I threw out a couple outliers, but so your pH is going to be around 7.3. Total, I'm not going to read through all these. You can see them. But if you know specifically that, say, your bicarbonate level is way higher than 94, you're probably not going to want to use these recipes as I have them. You're going to have to adjust.
Do these numbers change seasonally, or at least some of them?
Not around here. In the Cleveland area, it typically doesn't. Maybe, yeah. But, you know, I was amazed. I looked back at some reports back from like 2008, and they're all basically the same.
Go back to 95, yeah.
Really?
At some point you stop reading them.
Yeah. So if you move somewhere else, yes, you can have dramatic swings in different levels seasonally. But here in the Cleveland area, like I said in our first couple slides, we're really blessed with a real stable, consistent water source. So there's a lot of different brewing water spreadsheets that you can use. I use the brewing water spreadsheet. It's got quite a bit of information. I started using it before I knew anything about water, and it took me a long time before I knew how to use it correctly, because it's got lots of different tabs and lots of inputs. You enter in your actual grain bill, so it'll estimate the amount of acidity that's coming out of your grain bill, and it'll calculate your pH and everything. It's great.
So does easy, it just does one tab.
Yep, so Easy Water Calculator, that's what Mike here uses. That's only one tab. That might be a better spreadsheet to use if you're just first starting out. It's because it's only one tab. It does a lot of the the calculations itself behind the scenes. ProBrewer.com has some great online calculators. The Brewer's Friend does as well. AJ Delange, I don't know if Delan. Yeah, I have him linked as resources at the end, but and I think he actually links the nearly universal brewing water spreadsheet, if I recall. Most of the graphics that John Palmer uses in his How to Brew book or in his water book are actually AJ Delange's. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but he's.
I think you pronounce it Delange when you spoke.
Delange, yeah. The more I researched on water, the more I saw this guy's name, so he knows what he's talking about. And the late, great Greg Newton made a water witch spreadsheet, which was designed mostly for commercial breweries, and it's pretty simple, but it was back in the 90s when there wasn't a lot of different things available. But it's a pretty simple spreadsheet that you could use as well.
And just to let you know, Andrew, I've got a copy of Easy that I modified, that it changes all the grams to partial teaspoons, so if anybody needs to do that, it makes it a lot easier.
Okay.
My
Mark.
I don't have a good blood gram scale, so I can't measure them.
Oh, you should get one.
I'll let you borrow it.
Yeah. You should measure everything in grams, not pinches, and yeah. Okay. So this is an example. This is one of the tabs. I think this might have been an IPA that I made, but this is just one portion of the tab, actually, just the top portion. This is basically where I'm entering in the water import, or the water report. So this is my base water. You see these are the levels that I put for my assumed levels. I've got the 33 calcium, the 94 bicarbonate, and so on. And you can see down here I've got a nice ion balance, so your positives and negatives are balanced at 1. Got my pH in there, 7.3, so I'm good to go with that first tab. And I'm not going to go over everything that's in the spreadsheet because that could be a presentation on its own. But so the next tab that I have, I'm entering in a pre-selected water profile that I have in there. You can build your own water profiles and build them in. It's pretty easy in the spreadsheet to do that. So I just set it up for a pale ale profile. So the blue at the very top is my target profile. And the green right below it, that's my existing water profile. You can enter in a dilution percentage. That's if you're adding RO or distilled water. And then underneath is your finished water profile after you've salted it. And this is just a summary. So this is after you tell it exactly how big your batch is. This is after you've already added your grain bill. It's telling you how many grams you want to add to the mash and how many to the sparge. So this is a pretty complicated one. The easy water spreadsheet's a lot easier. We're getting there. We're almost done. First style example I chose was American IPA because that's what everybody likes to drink and brew. If you're not familiar with what an IPA is, it's a very bitter, hop-forward beer focused less on the malt, and it's showcasing the hops. I recommend...
How about going to the northeast of the U.S. and telling them what an IPA is?
Yeah. Yeah, when I say American, I don't mean Northeast. Yes. Yeah. So I'd recommend a sulfate to chloride ratio of at least 4:1, and that's parts per million, not weight necessarily. But you can do it lower, but if you want a good American IPA, I would do 4:1. At least. They go all the way up to 9:1. I've seen recipes for, but you get over 9:1, and it gets harsh, and you can go overboard. There's too much of a good thing. Too much sulfate. So in this example, it's pretty. So IPAs, you can have a pretty wide range of SRMs and grain bills and everything. So just for this example, I assume they're using just base malt, doing a pretty simple hop forward 2-row or Marisotter base, something like that. And you're shooting for brilliant clarity. So once again, not a Northeast IPA, and you're trying to mitigate your hop astringency. So those are the target levels I was shooting for. Shooting for a mash pH between 5.3 and 5.5. The HCO3 is your bicarbonates. So the reason that I have a range in there is because I have a couple options here. if you don't have a pH meter, I don't recommend adding lactic acid. If you want to, maybe start on the lower end. Make a couple batches to try and dial it in a little better. You can really screw up your IPA and make it taste sour if you add too much.
With all that gypsum, it's unlikely you would need any lactic acid if you did that.
Exactly. So you're already at 5.5 without any lactic acid.
Which
Which
will actually probably be lower in that amount of gypsum.
And I don't see.
well, that's what Brewing Water calculated. I don't
How
know.
would you want to go below 5.5 for a mash pH of an IPA?
I don't know. I mean, you can go down from 5.3 to 5.5 is a general range I like to keep it in, but usually on the lighter, the all. So IPAs are a little bit different in that they're a really light beer, but you don't necessarily have to acidulate anything because you're adding so much calcium to it, and the salts are bringing it down. That's why you'll find a lot of people around here that don't really play with their water too much. They don't even play with their mash pH. You can still make a really good IPA with the Cleveland water around here because you don't have to. You don't necessarily have to add any lactic acid to it because all the salts that you're adding are going to get you in that. Are going to get you in the correct pH range. So, yeah, the sodium, that's the same as your base water. I put this up here, 0% distilled. There's no reason to try to blend any distilled or RO water into it if you're making an IPA. Okay, next one I just put it in here because it's fun, because it's like the extreme example. But this is a Burton Ale. Burton-on-Trent is a city north of London, or a small city, I guess. But they use really deep old wells for their water, and it's an absurdly high mineral content, especially sulfate. So I call this an English Pale Ale, but it's really a Burtonized version of an English Pale Ale. It's a historical interpretation of it. So if you were using this water as they may have used 100 years ago to make English Pale Ale, this is how you could try to recreate that with Cleveland water. Now, a Burton Ale is going to have some crystal malt character, so your SRM's up around 10, so you're going to get some acidity coming out of your malt, not as much as a stout, but a lot more than you were out of that base malt IPA that I just showed. So you're still trying to accentuate the hop bitterness. That's not going to be an issue with the high mineral content here. And some of the minerally taste is actually acceptable in this one. Typically, you don't want your beers to taste too minerally, but if it's Burtonized, you expect it. And to be fair, these target levels aren't even as high as they should be for Burton. I just got scared when I saw some of them, so I didn't even want to go that high. So
You can add the gypsum to the kettle to get that profile. You know, rather than mess around with your mash, just do normal mash, and then
right.
the official term is a shitload of gypsum to the kettle.
The official term. So I have 225 parts per million of bicarbonate, but it's actually Burton water is 320, and sulfates I have 477. That seems high, but the Burton water is actually 820. Right. That's why I'm saying that's why I didn't want to go that high either. But that's
why they put that shit in ships and send it 9 months around the world.
yeah. It's basically where IPAs came from, right? This is where IPAs were born with this sort of water. This is where your ridiculous sulfate to chloride ratios come from. And yeah, obviously you don't need to add any RO or distilled to this one either. You've got plenty of salts to keep your pH in check. And I added some chalk just to increase them, try and get the bicarbonates up a little bit that are in the traditional, but I don't really recommend using chalk most of the time. Okay, here's another extreme example, at least compared to Burton. Cream ale. So this is a 100% base malt / adjunct beer, so it's very light SRM. This example I shot for about 4 to 5 SRM. I used 25%, 24% flaked corn. There's a picture of it. I'm going for brilliant clarity. I'm going for a clean, balanced beer with a balanced sulfate chloride ratio. And the main thing that I'm trying to focus here is to mitigate the mineral harshness. So my target levels, 5.5. Oh, am I off?
No, just 1 parts per million of bicarbonate.
Well, okay. So that's after I added the lactic acid, though.
I'm sorry, it didn't go away, it's still there.
It's going to get even worse. Just wait. Wait till I get to a negative. I have a negative coming up. So 1 part per million, that's basically because the lactic acid has neutralized your bicarbonate in your water. So this is the target level that I'm trying to get after I've added the lactic acid to it. So your pH is around 5.5, your calcium and your sulfates are right around the same, around 55, so it's just enough calcium so you have good clarity.
So you mean that you're balancing it? You don't mean that it's hot that you're cutting it out. I mean, it's not disappearing, it's still there.
Right. What did I say? That's what I meant.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're balancing it, but you really, the bicarbonate that's there is
Right.
there.
So that's the effective bicarbonate, I should say.
From the pH perspective, yes.
Right. So your sulfate chloride is pretty balanced. I'm using about 50% RO. I'm trying to get the bicarbonate level down to begin with. That's going to help take away from some of that mineral harshness in your finish. And once again, I don't recommend using lactic acid unless you have a pH meter, but if you do, 0.25 milligrams per gallon is a pretty low amount, so you'd probably be safe with it. Next one, an English porter. So in comparison to an American porter, which is a lot hoppier, a lot roastier, or at least a little roastier, an English porter is going to be maltier, chocolatier, generally softer than U.S. versions. They use a copious amount of dark and roasted malt, and historically they've used brown malt. I don't know if you can even buy brown malt traditionally anymore the way it used to be made, but traditionally they use a lot of brown malt for this style. So you have a relatively high SRM, well, very high SRM actually. So you're going to have a lot of malt-driven acidity that's going to help keep your mash pH in check with the bicarbonate levels that we have in our Cleveland water. So it's got a traditionally hard water profile, but I am going to go more towards the malty side on this beer since it's not an American porter. So you actually have a little bit more chloride than sulfate in this one. Just a little, didn't go too crazy. You generally don't want to, so you can go really high, you can do up to 9-to-1 sulfate to chloride, but you don't want to go the other way. You don't want to be 1-to-9. It doesn't work in reverse if you're trying to do a super malty beer. You want to keep it a lot closer. So there are my target levels. My bicarbonate are right around what you get out of the water to begin with because I'm not mixing it with anything. I'm not adding any lactic acid to it. I wouldn't add chalk to it. Really, if you were trying to recreate a London water profile, you could. I have some instructions down there on how to do that, but I wouldn't recommend it. You don't need to. Really, you shouldn't be trying to rebuild. For the most part, I don't recommend trying to build these water profiles based on the city of origin of this beer. You can look at it as historic reference. You can wonder how they may have treated it, but if you're just trying to copy the water profile that's coming out of their taps, that's not necessarily going to make the best English porter, or the best Burton Ale, or the best Helles, definitely. So don't target your water profiles based on the city that it's coming from. Figure out what these different salts, different ions are doing to your water. Figure out, well, I want to accentuate this or that. How do I get there? How am I going to, what sort of ions do I want to add? Where do I want my ratio to be? I don't know if there's anywhere in the US that has a 9-to-1 sulfate to chloride ratio, but we're making great IPAs over here, so that's basically my 2 cents on that one. But this is basically just a maltier beer compared to the others. Next one, this is the water profile. Now, if I did this again, this is what... Lagerfeuer. This is the award-winning smoked Helles that Mike and I brewed. And thank you. It's been a few years. This was the Son of Brazil winner in 2013, and this is a water profile that we used. Helles lagers are interesting because they're Munich Helleses, right? And Munich water is much harder than some of the southern German water, but a Helles lager is a light beer. So hard water and light beer, you're going to have to do something to it. You typically you don't want to use very hard water for a light beer. So I'm going to dilute this one a little bit. So you have a low acidity grain bill. I keep saying I for this one, but so we used mostly base malt. I mean, maybe a touch, maybe like 1 or 2. Well, we use smoked malt, which is smoked Pilsner malt, but.
Right. It's pretty much all Pilsner.
Yeah, so it's pretty much all Pilsner.
Do you know if smoking the malt changes the pH?
Makes you choke.
Yeah, I'm not sure. My recipe doesn't assume that you're using smoked malt, but
Just out of curiosity, the professional brewers who use smoked malt, do you notice any pH change from that over regular pills?
okay. So inconsequential amount of pH change from using smoked malt compared to regular base malt.
6 SRN? Were we that?
Yeah. So we were down at 6. It can be a little bit more golden. It can be a little bit darker, but it's basically a really light beer. Am I wrong, Rick?
Is this an ABC scale or is this American SRN?
This was your recipe, Mike. Okay, so and I'm not saying this is the best Helles water recipe. I'm sure there's people in here that are going to argue with me on this. This is just what we used, and we had good results for it. So basically, you want to get your mineral content pretty low, even though traditionally Munich water has higher mineral content. So we used about 75% distilled water in ours, and only about 25% tap. And then we built up a little bit because we were trying to bring those bicarbonates down, and you can see we're at negative 51 parts per million of bicarbonates. That's basically how much you can add 51 more parts per million of bicarbonate before it can have a buffering effect. So yeah, you can't have a negative amount of something, but
So would that be a lower residual alkalinity?
yes, exactly.
Can I ask why the gypsum?
We were trying to get our calcium up a little bit more than where it was for proper flocculation, but 67 is even a little bit higher than we needed to.
I'm just wondering why you didn't just use all calcium
Oh,
chloride.
straight calcium
Something
chloride, yeah.
Softer.
Didn't want to go too far. Chloride
Yeah, I was just curious. People usually use calcium chloride instead of gypsum or something like that.
Right, and we used more calcium chloride than gypsum in this,
Yeah.
but
From the gut? A gut feeling, maybe?
Gut feeling.
yes,
That's
a
good
gut
answer.
filling. Yeah. Stop picking on me, we won with this beer.
That's why I asked why. What were you thinking? I'm just asking
But-
why. I assume you had a reason.
You
Yeah.
have to pick on anyone. It's me. I'm the one that came with the water idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, we didn't want to throw off the chloride sulfate ratio too far. It's still, I think this one's around 0.8. So that's basically what we were shooting for. So this isn't beer related, but I brought some of this coffee with me. Those of you that have talked to me for more than 5 minutes know that I really like coffee as well as beer. Brewed coffee is going to have a pH of about 5, and amazingly, there's almost no limit to how high a pH you can use starting water for. It's still going to end up being down to 5. I've actually read where people were using ridiculous amounts up at like 10.5 pH for their starting water. Their coffee was still 5 pH. It didn't taste very good. It would actually, what it would do is it would just continue to strip more things out of those roasted grains. So at the higher pH until it made it back down to 5. And at those higher ends, it was stripping out some pretty terrible things out of the coffee. So anyways, the higher the pH starting water that you have, the more acid, the more flavor, and acid's a good thing in coffee if you're trying to extract flavor compounds out of it. So the higher pH starting water, the better. to an extent, you can obviously go too high. And 10.5 pH, by the way, is not safe to consume normally. You'd want to test that coffee before you took a sip of it. So you have a fairly narrow bicarbonate range. You have somewhere between, for the ideal brewing zone, somewhere between about 35 and 75 parts per million of bicarbonate. The two main ions that you're worried about in coffee are magnesium and calcium, and they basically have the same effect. They extract body and flavor out of well, they add body and they extract flavor out of the coffee. Magnesium is a little bit more efficient of a extractor, so I did add some Epsom salt to this recipe. From what I've read, if you just want to stay away from magnesium, just do calcium chloride instead. You're going to have very little difference in your overall water or coffee profile. So there are my target levels, my coffee pH, my bicarbonates, my calcium, magnesium. The important thing that I'm trying to hit is a calcium magnesium combined, and it doesn't matter how much you have of each. Well, basically you want to have, that's your general hardness, your calcium and magnesium, you want that to be 125 parts per million. That's what I was targeting. You have a little bit of a range if you look back in this graph. But Cleveland water would be, let's see, I think Cleveland water would be somewhere around here. So it would be outside of the ideal brewing zone. So you do want to treat it a little bit. So to get there, to lower your bicarbonates, I recommend going 1 part distilled to 2 parts tap water. That'll get you down at around 65 parts per million. And then I add some Epsom salt and calcium chloride. If you're comfortable using one of those brewing water spreadsheets, that's actually how I calculated this. So you can use that to change this ratio. I use, just because these are even numbers and it's easy to remember, 1 gram per gallon of Epsom salt, 1 gram per gallon of calcium chloride is going to get you there. Now, got to be careful if you have a sensitive system. Epsom salt can be a diuretic at levels over 125. This is nowhere near that. This is 32. If you've got a sensitive system, like I've heard some people do, you might want to change this to be more heavy on the calcium chloride side. I like having a little bit of Epsom salt in this one, even though it's harder to dissolve. So basically, yes? Yeah, so I do that actually.
Once I make the sauce, how long is it good for?
I haven't tested it, how long it's good for. That's interesting though. Maybe I should start taking readings to see if any of the ions are reacting and changing their levels. Right now I make 3 gallons at a time for my coffee, and I drink a fair amount of coffee, so that lasts me maybe 2 weeks. But I don't worry about that. I leave it on my counter. I don't even leave it in the fridge. But you can make less. It's just easier to make larger volumes when you're measuring things like this out. Yes, Tim?
So what about acidifying the water with like phosphor?
That's the opposite direction you want to go. You don't want to acidify your water. The higher the pH. No, 5 is what you're going to hit. You don't really.
7, let's say for a gallon,
Right.
right?
Sure. You don't want to acidify it to get it down to 5. The coffee itself is going to bring it down to 5.
Okay, but you were saying that it was closer because the higher pH was stripping out good flavors.
To a certain degree, yeah. So if you go up to like 8.5 pH starting water, I don't know what you're going to add to your water at that point, maybe lime. I haven't played with trying to raise pH because I'm a brewer and I never try to raise pH, but.
With the chloride level, you put in, what does the pH come down to?
I'm not sure. I haven't tested it. No, I haven't tested it. That's actually one of my last slides, which don't worry people, I'm almost there. One of my last slides. That's one of my future experiments. I know I promised you a super exciting water presentation. This is about as exciting as it gets. Okay, so future experiments, high pH coffee water. Yeah, I've seen it actually as high as 11.5, which I would not want to go anywhere near that.
Drain cleaner? There you go.
Yeah, exactly. That'll. Okay, another thing I want to do, so the strips that we got with our brewing iDip test don't include chlorine, but you can buy another bottle of these, 25 strips come in these, and start doing chlorine tests with the same unit. You don't have to buy a separate unit, you just buy different strips. So that's one of the things I'm going to be doing soon, is testing just chlorine removal. So how long it takes in standing water to remove chlorine. You got to know your starting point, obviously, and even that changes around here. So, and Camden tablet effectiveness and carbon filter lifespans. Those are some of the things I've been thinking about. I recently brewed a Northeast style IPA. Don't ask me why. East Coast IPA. Yeah. So I used a very low flocculating yeast for that. I used a Kolsch yeast for it. But I'm wondering at this point if maybe I could try to duplicate that with a really low calcium profile to try and inhibit flocculation that way and use a more normal. Just something I'm thinking about. I don't know. That's obviously not going to end up with a very bitter IPA either, but I've seen some of those styles that are really low IBUs too. And another thing I was thinking about playing with is maybe tea or kombucha water profiles, since I already dug into coffee a little bit. So don't believe me. As you could probably tell, I'm not a chemist, and I don't really know what I'm talking about. So these are some of the resources that I used. These are great, great books and great websites that you can use. The Water book by John Palmer. I got a lot of information off his website, so it's basically the How to Brew book. And then AJ DeLange is in there. Martin Brungard, who makes the Brew and Water spreadsheet. He doesn't just make the spreadsheet, he also has a ton of information on his website. And even built into the web sheet itself, there's a lot of educational information there. Just hover over the cells and you learn something new. And I also went to the Center for Disease Control to learn about learn about taking organics and how to get chloramine out of your water. Okay, I'm done. Hold your applause until the questions are over.
I would like to propose that your presentation be put on the web under the tools.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to share this presentation for sure. So, yeah, it'll be in the newsletter. We'll send a link, or it'll be on the website.
It'll be under tools, yeah.
Yeah, under tools. If you believed anything I said and want to use any of my recipes.
With the other presentations on.
Yeah. Yes, Erica?
Yeah, so let's say I use a carbon filter, how should I adjust my Cleveland water profile if I'm looking at your Cleveland water profile? Does it just take out the chlorine?
Well, carbon filter is just going to take out chlorine, chloramine, zinc, which is not a real important brewing mineral, and organics. So, well, to a level, but you're.
If you add yeast nutrient, you're good.
Yeah.
Add some yeast nutrient and you're fine. In your boil. With the zinc.
Right. I'm also not sure how effective it is at stripping zinc out if it's taking 100% out. But it's just one of the few chemicals that a carbon filter will also remove.
But I don't have to worry about any of the ions?
None of the other ions, no. It shouldn't soften your water, not unless you're using some kind of cartridge that also has ion exchange resins, yeah.
What was that last comment that Rick made about adding yeast nutrients to the oil? What's that do?
Right, so a carbon filter will strip out some of the zinc, which is an important yeast nutrient. So if you're using a carbon filter, I guess we're recommending adding yeast nutrient back in because it'll...
But not the cheap diammonium phosphate stuff. Add cerbomyces or something else with zinc in it.
Okay.
And we don't have a lot of zinc in our water. So.
Good. The white yeast stuff is good.
Are there any other...
Don't do the old cap stuff.
Did you have a question?
That's it? Did you turn the camera on?
Don't buy rough.
Oh, and don't...
So the difference between Ed and Gypsum in the mash and in the boil, or like an IPA? I mean, I know you have to hit it pretty hard in the boil.
So if you're trying to get like a more of a mineral taste and profile to it, you can add it to the boil. If you're not necessarily trying to reduce to lower your pH, maybe the boil is a better place to put it. If you're trying to do like if you're Burtonizing your water and trying to get a real minerally taste, but not necessarily.
To equalize your pH and your mash, and then
Right.
chips in the boil to accentuate hops.
Yeah, but
Sure.
you still have to account for both those components, calcium and, the sulfate into your final, but it's not at the same level. So in your mash, some of that's gonna be left behind with the grain. So you gotta assume that you're gonna leave some of that behind. So you don't assume it's 100% of that's coming in your final work.
Is there a percentage? I mean, is there a
I
given?
generally go with 50% because no one really, each match is different, you never know, but
I got you.
I did a little bit of research on it. I mean, no one really knows that answer. I just choose 50%. So if I'm targeting a sulfite or chloride profile in the end work,
Right.
and I know what I'm adding in, and I probably would sub back 50% of the kettle.
Cool.
But that option always exists, just add it at the end too, and you can just adjust with acidified malt or the phosphoric or lactic as well. Not even worry about the salt of that. Then you know what your number is.
All right, so and I know that's a ridiculously long link down at the bottom, but I'm going to be sharing this presentation. You go to that link, that's where I have listed all of the different water reports from the Cleveland area that I've compiled. There's a couple dozen of them. Some of them are professional, some of them are amateur, done by me with my photometer, but I list, they're not anonymous. I listed where they came from, so you know which ones to trust. They're all pretty similar though.
Good job.